Hi, Chris Borgmeyer here again from Portland State University. And so we're going to continue with our Tier 2 series here. And now we're going to take a look at kind of alternative or additional Tier 2 interventions, those that are not maybe directly connected to check-in, check-out. So you can find some of these materials on www.sw-pbis.com under the Tier 2 tab or under the Tier 2 page. All right, so the objectives of this session are to kind of review again some of the critical features of Tier 2 systems and Tier 2 interventions, mostly Tier 2 interventions within an MTSS framework. We're going to look at other interventions that are commonly referred to as Tier 2 interventions, and then we're going to actually look at check-in, check-out a little bit as a model to try to maximize the benefits of other Tier 2 interventions. So there may be some Tier 2 interventions out there that you're using that have some holes in them when we think about how they're going to fit effectively within a Tier 2 system. So this first we're going to review a couple things that I think we've discussed previously. So some of the major features of Tier 2 interventions, and so my colleague Cindy Anderson and I wrote a paper on this back in 2010. But some of the things we want to see in Tier 2 interventions are early identification of students and early intervention. Intervention should be continuously available. That means there's some element of support that's always there with the student throughout the day. And so it's not something that happens on Fridays at 3 o'clock. The Tier 2 intervention should have a connection to the entirety of the student's day. Students should be able to receive rapid access to the intervention. So again, this is kind of a capacity issue. We got to have the capacity so that we can serve enough students so that if a new student is referred, we can get them access to an intervention within 72 hours. We don't want to have to wait 2.5 months before a spot opens up, because that's not going to be early intervention or rapid access. So Tier 2 intervention should require low effort by the teachers, not a lot of effort. They're not doing a lot of work. We don't want teachers feeling like, I'd refer a student for check-in, check-out, or I'd refer a student to a Tier 2 intervention, but then I've got 18 hours of work to do to make it happen or something like that. We want to make sure that it's a low effort for the teachers. We like to have a clear link to the school-wide expectations, the school-wide rules, so that we can fade kids back to those school-wide rules and school-wide supports more easily. All staff and faculty in a school should know their role and understand their responsibilities related to implementation and supporting students on the Tier 2 interventions. As you've sort of seen in the previous modules, we like to for our Tier 2 interventions to be adaptable and to be flexible so that we can start matching them to function of behavior. We do need to have resources available so that these interventions can be run without a hitch, so that they can be efficient and effective in their implementation. And so when we talked about check-in, check-out, we're usually talking about about 10 hours a week for check-in responsibilities, check-out responsibilities, and then just general coordination and regular meetings for decision making. And then finally, that continuous monitoring for decision making, which is going to require us to have good measures that are going to be sensitive to change. And so, again, just taking us through some of those major features of Tier 2 intervention. So another great tool that we can use is the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, and there's a Tier 2 section. And I just pulled one item out of this section, so out of the Tier 2 section, so item 2.6. And you can see there's some additional items here that they identify are really important and critical to Tier 2 interventions. And so those are that students should be receiving additional instruction and additional time for student skill development. Whenever there's a Tier 2 intervention, there should always be some skills we're teaching and where we're supporting students to build. There should be additional structure, predictability built into the student schedule. So this can be prompting, visual prompting, just regular interactions and feedback and some of those things to increase in predictability and structure. And then the last one kind of rolls into that, the increased opportunities for feedback, where we see things like daily progress reports and those sorts of things. So those are features that we are looking for in our Tier 2 interventions. And this just summarizes again those things that were on that previous slide. So in the tiered fidelity inventory, there's a form that looks like this, a reference guide for targeted or Tier 2 interventions, and you can see down at the bottom of this form, the last four categories here are things that are specifically related to the intervention, things that we want to see in a tier 2 intervention. And so these prompts for what to do throughout the day. One of the things we want to think about is across our tier 2 intervention options, do we have these prompts? Um, at least five times during the day, the student is receiving positive feedback or has the opportunity to receive positive feedback. Do we have that built into the day? Is there a school-home communication system that's a possibility, so we can link school and home supports? And then is the an opportunity to adapt the intervention into more of a self-management system, so the student takes increasing responsibility for their behavior, and we can move towards fading them off the program and the supports to have success with greater independence. So those are things that we want to be looking for when we're thinking about tier 2 interventions. So we're going to kind of reflect on briefly on the check-in check-out system as a model for this. And so the check-in check-out system does a lot of things really well as a tier 2 intervention. And so what I'm going to encourage you and challenge you to do is think about, as we talk about some of these other tier 2 intervention possibilities, how could we take things that we've learned from check-in check-out and maybe use those to supplement the other programs that we're implementing. So some things are, having a reliable check-in and check-out for the student, having some rewards at the end of the day if the student meets their goal, and just having a daily point card for regular prompting and feedback across the school setting. And so those are kind of really good ways to make sure the intervention isn't kind of an isolated occurrence, but is kind of with the student throughout the day and across all settings. And so I'm going to really encourage you to think about, can you use that daily point card framework as a way to bring the interventions to life throughout the school day for the student and make connections between maybe training and skill development in isolation and kind of bridge that gap to real world implementation and settings. So when we think about this, again, those when we look at check-in, check-out, you can see here, if we look at check-in, check-out, those bottom 4 prompts, check-in, check-out has them all covered. And so there are those structural prompts. There's a lot of opportunities for positive feedback. There's the potential for school-home communication, and it can morph into a self-management system pretty easily. So the next thing is, as we look at these other 4 interventions, how might we kind of expand or adapt these 4 intervention features to include more of those 4 features? And so how could we take social skills instruction or reading buddies or homework club or lunch buddies and maybe, strengthen those programs to include more of these features that we see in check-in, check-out, or use check-in, check-out as a model for increasing the efficacy and the effectiveness of those different programs. And it may not be a perfect fit for all of them, but again, just thinking about how can we take what we've learned from check-in, check-out and strengthen and make more robust some of these intervention options. So one of the things we've looked at is we did a survey of schools across the country, asking them to identify what tier 2 interventions they're implementing within their schools. Most of these schools were schools that were implementing school-wide PBIS. And so this full article, I think, was a reading for the class and was made available in Preventing School Failure. But the respondents, we had 180 respondents from 8 states. 172 of the schools were implementing PBIS, and you can see the breakdown across school level and by school role for the people who responded. So these were the most frequently identified tier 2 interventions across schools. So check-in, check-out was the most frequently identified tier 2 intervention, followed by behavioral contracts, mentoring, social skills training, and academic skills training. And so those were the reported from the schools that we interacted with. And so here you can see just across time, schools increasingly use check-in, check-out the more years that they had been implementing school-wide positive behavior support. And so you can see behavioral contracts started out as the highest, probably the most highly implemented, but quickly was surpassed by check-in, check-out. Then we see a drop-off in behavioral contracts towards the end of the fifth year or more. So just kind of interesting to see the growth of check-in, check-out, and how social skills and mentoring kind of stayed the same, even though these were among the 4 most common tier 2 interventions identified. So the thing about check in, check out is that we very clearly know what the critical features for implementation fidelity are. There's a lot of research support that identifies the effectiveness and that schools can actually implement check in, check out in an efficient manner in schools and with the resources available already. And so, there's this book, the responding to problem behavior in schools. You can find that book, and it'll walk you through. But we've got a number of different ways that we've identified and clearly outlined how to implement check in, check out with fidelity. And this is different than a lot of tier 2 interventions. A lot of tier 2 interventions, we don't really have any idea of what would be implementation fidelity. So, for example, if we're implementing a Lunch Buddies program or a social skills group or an anger management group or a homework club, what are the features that mark implementation with fidelity for each of these programs? And the reality is we don't know. We don't really have good answers for that, and that's where we start to run into some troubles, because your social skills group is different than my social skills group, and it's actually makes it really hard for us to make blanket statements that say social skills groups are an effective intervention. So until we can start defining what some of those critical features are and what implementation fidelity looks like, it's hard for us to really promote widely any of these tier 2 interventions. Now, this doesn't mean that any of these interventions can't be effective. It just means we probably have to pay a closer attention to our effectiveness data and make sure we have good data to really ensure that the resources we're investing in these interventions are providing the outcomes that we want. So, just because these interventions might be easy to implement, it doesn't mean they're effective or they're worthwhile as tier 2 interventions. So we really want to be thoughtful. More interventions is not necessarily more benefit for students. So we could be investing, anytime we're running a Lunch Buddies or an anger management group, somebody's got to be running that, coordinating that, investing some minutes in doing that. And so the question becomes, is this the best use of our minutes in schools where oftentimes we are strapped for minutes? And so just because it's easy to do doesn't mean it's working for kids. And we really always got to come back and say, is this working for kids? And if it's not, we either need to change interventions or we need to really look at what are the critical features of this intervention that are going to make a difference for students, and we need to modify our intervention. At the same time, always weighing, the effort we're putting in, does it justify the outcomes that we're getting? So we do need to clearly define what are the outcomes we want to accomplish from each of these different tier 2 interventions. So one example, which is the Lunch Buddies program, I've looked into the research literature on Lunch Buddies, and the thing is, there are a couple research studies out there that have been conducted with the Lunch Buddies program. But there's widely varying descriptions of what the program looks like. And so the folks that we surveyed, everybody had kind of a different definition of what Lunch Buddies was in their school. So there's not a lot of consistency between what we found in the research. So you can see Cavell, it looks like Cavell or Cavell, I'd guess Cavell, is an author on both of these articles here. These were really the only two research studies on Lunch Buddies that we found. And so you can see Cavell is the kind of the common thread here. So we looked at the study, and some mentors, they identified college students and they assigned them to students at the school. The college students were to visit twice a week during lunch for an average about 30 minutes. The college students received a 2-page handout as their training, describing what their roles and responsibilities were as mentoring and some tips for listening and communicating with mentees. When you looked at the results of the research study, they really were inconclusive. There wasn't a lot of evidence that the program was effective. So it was a published research study, but when you read it, it didn't actually. They did define what Lunch Buddies was, but it wasn't found to be conclusive that the program was effective. And then as you look at the folks we surveyed, 20 respondents said they did it, but there was wide variability, and none of the descriptions of Lunch Buddies by those schools matched what Cavell was doing. And I mean, there's not a lot of reason to match it because the results were inconclusive. But so you see the kind of the quandary we're in with some of these tier 2 interventions where there's not clear research support, it's not clearly defined, and people are doing something, but we really don't know what the support is for doing those things. So, so in those cases, we need to think about how do we measure student outcomes, and are we, because we're going to have to really rely heavily on our own measurement to determine whether or not the intervention is being effective. So another common challenge to many interventions at the tier 2 level is a lot of these interventions, there might be a research base behind them, but they may not be set up to really be efficient for implementation in schools. They may be too time and resource intensive, or they may just be difficult to sort of implement in schools in a real world school setting at a scale that's going to be meaningful. Maybe if we want them to serve 2 to 3, 4% of the students in the school, can we kind of scale up the tier 2 intervention like that? So a couple interventions that have really great research support are First Steps to Success and the Check and Connect program. So these are two programs that have great research support. If you look on What Works Clearinghouse, there's they're really strong, robust interventions. The question now is, one of the questions I have kind of in my head is, are these tier 2 or tier 3? Because both of these are pretty intensive interventions, and the amount of resource required to carry them out, it's going to require a lot of training, a lot of coordination, and a lot of personnel and resources to carry it out. And so we've got some school districts that have been doing a nice job with First Steps to Success locally. I don't have any experience really with school districts implementing Check and Connect regularly, and this shouldn't be mistaken with check in, check out, which some schools call their check in, check out program. Some people will title it Check and Connect, but this Check and Connect comes out of the University of Minnesota, and it's a dropout prevention program. That's much more involved than a check-in check-out program in the schools. So there's some resources here, and if you're taking the PBS coaching course for tier 2 through Portland State University, there's you can find these links on the training module for today. So we've got some great interventions, but the question is, can we actually implement them and carry them out at the tier 2, tier 3 level? And usually schools are going to have a really hard time doing this. So for example, First Step to Success really requires having an external mentor who actually comes into the school for I think it's at least 2 weeks, and where they're providing support, direct support to the student, and they slowly move further and further away and transition the in-school program to the teacher. Now, maybe even more time consuming is the going to the homes and doing the home base aspect of the program, which is meeting with the parents and the child and doing some lessons around some games that they're supposed to play, and checking in with them regularly for the next month. And so again, a great program, and part of the challenge is training people, having people trained to and who have the freedom of the flexibility to go into the home and provide the home-based training, as well as doing the in-school, the class training as they call it. So that's one of the challenges there. And Check and Connect, that requires like a 2-year commitment from a mentor outside of the school. It's someone who's connecting with the student more external to the school usually, and they require a significant, substantial amount of training to be a mentor in the program. And so those are both things that are oftentimes prohibitive in terms of implementation at the school level, unless you're really supported by a good district or a regional implementation plan where you can access First Step to Success coaches or Check and Connect mentors and coaches. So that's something that's prohibitive. They're both great interventions, but they're really challenging to implement within a school context without a good deal of coordination and planning from the school district or maybe a regional service provider. All right, so going back to the tier 2 fidelity, or the tiered fidelity inventory, and those features that we talked about is additional structure or time for instruction and skill development, more predictability, and increased opportunities for feedback. So we're going to talk about an intervention like social skills instruction. So, all kinds of people are doing social skills instruction across the country. It's very widely used and widely implemented. But for years, there have been real concerns about the efficacy of social skills instruction. Some of the scientific articles out there, ask the question: should we When we're talking about social skills instruction, one of Frank Gresham's articles is, should we raise, in terms of, should we just level it and start over? Should we remodel? What are we talking about? Because social skills instruction isn't really coming through and following through and providing the outcomes that we hope it would. And so one of the big problems here is people see a lot of social skills instruction as this train and hope model. And so students oftentimes come together once a week on a Friday at the end of the day and go through a 30-minute social skills lesson. And oftentimes there's little done to bridge the gap from learning that in this isolated classroom to actually carrying this out in real world environments in the school and throughout the school day. And so Gresham argues that we really need to take a more contextual approach to social skills instruction, so that there's prompts and supports in the natural settings and opportunities for incidental teaching in the natural settings, with a focus on the skills that these kids are supposed to be practicing. So here's one of the things I wanted you to think about is, how might you take social skills groups that are currently maybe occurring in your school? You've got resources invested in those, and how could you maybe transform those or supplement those to have some more of the outcomes that we want to see them? Oftentimes social skills groups, people aren't even measuring the outcomes, and so how can we take this next step to really provide some of the features of a check-in, check-out, or some of the requirements that we want to see in a tier 2 intervention, so that it can be a legitimate intervention within a tier 2 system of support. So common traditional model, things that I commonly see with social skills groups, some of those things I just mentioned. We meet every Friday in a small group of at-risk students. We usually meet, down at the end of the hall in the counselor's office, a very contrived environment and probably a very safe environment. We might have chosen a published curriculum and we're progressing through the lessons, whatever the order of that program might be. We rely a lot on teach and hope. Train and hope. So we teach in that Friday in that little contrived setting, and then we don't really have mention of it again until we see the students again the following Friday. And so that's problematic. Really a lack of prompts or attention to supporting social skill use in the school environment. And then the students don't really get much feedback for real world implementation of those skills on a regular basis in the school setting. So the question becomes, what's missing when we look at those features of tier 2 interventions that are on that tiered fidelity inventory? What are ways we can bring additional structure or time for instruction and skill development? How could we bring more structure and predictability in the student's day, and can we provide more regular opportunities for feedback? So think about how things we might do to transform some of the way we're providing social skills instruction to incorporate some of these features. So maybe a modified model would be something like, instead of meeting every week or every couple weeks, maybe we meet every day for 7 days, and we do much more of a blast where there's a real focus on building these specific skills. Maybe we start targeting specific skills the students are lacking, that we can have a real connection to the real world application. And so maybe it's less about empathy as this big broad concept, and it's more about, how do we ask peers to share a toy during playtime or free time or recess? How do we have appropriate greetings with adults when we pass them in the hallway, or at the beginning of the day or the end of the day or at lunch or something like that? And so how do we take specific skills that we see students needing more instruction in, that have a real close tie to helping them benefit with more productive interactions and conversations in the real world in the school setting? And then we could go and practice real world scenarios in the school settings where these are most likely to occur. So let's get out of the counselor's office and let's go down to the lunchroom or the cafeteria and practice some of these skills there. Then maybe we could have a link with the daily progress report, where we have specific categories that really target those specific skills the student's going to be working on. And so we can give them feedback on use of those skills, and then we can also prompt them. And so, we could check in with the student at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, and we could prompt them and remind them that we're working on and we're looking for those skills. And we could do a little role play before they even go out in the day. And then when they come into the classroom and they hand me the point card, if I'm the teacher, I could prompt them and say, hey, remember, this might be a good time for you to use some of these skills. And then we're going to give them feedback on those skills regularly throughout the day. And as they start to master those, we could, then maybe move on to the next skill when we're talking about, a more intensive approach for a week or a week and a half to really try to build those skills. So I don't know how, you'll have to reflect on what you think about that, or how you might modify some of the social skills group to maybe better meet the students' needs and use a more effective instructional approach. And I know that scheduling is sometimes a big question here, but again, the question is why would we take kids out of academic instruction for a really poor model of implementation of social skills, rather than, think about how to really maximize those minutes so that we can hopefully get back some of those instructional minutes in the long run around the academic side. But it might mean manipulating our schedule a little bit more in the name of effectiveness and ultimate student outcomes. So because we can really never be assured of the effectiveness of any Tier 2 intervention, whether that's check-in, check-out, or social skills, it's absolutely critical, because of individual student differences, that we have a good progress monitoring system. And this becomes even more critical when we're talking about some of these interventions that we really don't have much evidence for the efficacy of these interventions, or we don't know how to implement them with fidelity. For instance, social skills instruction or anger management groups. What can we really focus on to try to measure the outcomes, because we need good measurement tools to see whether or not these interventions are having the desired effect. So office discipline referrals, I would argue, are not a sensitive enough measure of change, and that's why we go to a more precise and a more regular progress monitoring system, something like the daily point card, where we can get more precise daily feedback on how the student's doing, or hourly feedback on how they're doing with maybe some targeted skills. So when in our survey we asked folks, do you measure outcomes for specific Tier 2 interventions? And you can see, there's kind of a decreasing number of people who measure. When you get into lunch buddies and cultural groups and homework clubs, half or less of those interventions actually measure outcomes in some tangible way. And then the question is, well, how effectively are they actually measuring those? And so we can see, with check-in, check-out, we're using largely the daily progress reports. Behavior contracts, we use all kinds of different measures. And then social skills, a lot of people are just relying on office discipline referrals and teacher reports. And so, we might be able to do better and get more precise data with using a daily progress report or a daily point card to monitor some of the social skills outcomes. Again, using some of what we've learned about the check-in, check-out, and some of those features of check-in, check-out that have been so helpful and so useful. And you could then graph their data just the same way you do on check-in, check-out, using either the Excel template or some of the other graphing programs. So one of the things we want to know is, are your measures sensitive enough to change? When we're talking about Tier 2, Tier 3, we want to have more sensitive measures so we can monitor student progress and be more responsive to our data than we do for Tier 1 students who aren't nearly as high a risk. So another intervention example is the homework club. And so we might think about, what are the critical features of an effective homework club? And what does it look like at your school? And so, that's a big question. Like, what should homework club look like? And I haven't looked into the research literature to see if there are proven studies around homework club or not, but it's worth looking into. And then what's the goal of the Tier 2 intervention? If it's a Tier 2 behavioral intervention, what we're probably thinking is, if kids can do their homework, it should reduce the negative interaction they're likely to have with their teacher right to start off their period, which gets them off on the wrong foot because they don't have their homework done. It might limit their participation or their interest in content in the class because they may not have some of the prerequisite knowledge or skills to carry out the task for the day if they didn't do their reading, or if they didn't do one of the homework assignments, which might lend itself to more challenging behavior. And so there might be behavioral outcomes that we'd like to see, reductions in negative language or some of these sorts of things, and there likely are going to be academic outcomes that we'd like to see in terms of increased work completion for the students. So the question is, how can you evaluate progress toward this goal in an observable and measurable way? And I think, when we look at programs like the ABC check-in, check-out, the academic behavior check-in, check-out, homework club would fit really great with an intervention like that, where you're measuring and you're monitoring the social outcomes, but you're also measuring the homework completion outcomes to see, really look at the efficacy of homework club. And so homework club just makes a lot of sense to pair that with a program like the ABC check in, check out. And so this looks relatively similar, but the point card for um, check in, check out, or academic behavior check in, check out, and then we can graph the data over time to see if participation in homework club is having an impact on some of the social behavior for the student, which is the goal of our check in, check out system, or in this case the homework club system. I'm sorry. So as we think about these things and reflect, guidelines for tier 2 interventions, you want to think about, are we clearly identifying observable and measurable goals and outcomes for the interventions that we're using? And then once we've identified the observable and measurable goals and outcomes that we want to have, do we have a sensitive way to measure change in those behaviors? And again, with check in, check out, the daily point card is a great example of that. Do we have clearly defined features of intervention implementation so that we can determine whether or not we're implementing with fidelity? So do we have clearly defined what homework clubs should look like, what lunch buddies should look like, what check-in, check-out should look like, so that we can make sure that we are implementing with high fidelity? And if we're implementing with fidelity but it's not working, well, then clearly we got to use our data to change the intervention, or maybe make a decision that, well, this might not be the best allocation of our resources. And then use your data to assess the effectiveness and the efficiency, and putting all these pieces together and making sure, as I just mentioned, your student outcomes are worth the cost and the investment that's being put in. So that is kind of a summary of tier 2 interventions and considerations. If you've got a range of other tier 2 interventions that you might have in place, or you're thinking about, these challenges around fidelity of implementation, what does that mean? And really making sure that we're putting in place measures so that we can at least have some decision-making tools, so that we can make sure that we are investing wisely and appropriately, and we're actually getting the benefits from an intervention that we hope for and want to see. All right, so you may want to go and look and see, do we have some other tier 2 interventions in place, or are we thinking about some tier 2 interventions, or the things we could do to modify or strengthen some of the tier 2 interventions we have? So you might pull out this targeted interventions reference guide map, and if you've got a social skills club or a peer mentors or some of these other programs, what's the extent that these are really programs that have some of these critical features in place that we look for in the tiered fidelity inventory. So looking again at these bottom 4 or 5 options here, is there additional structural prompts? Is there more feedback? Do we have a school-home connection? Can it adapt into a self-management program? And do we have explicit instruction of the expected skills and behaviors? And so just take a look and think about, how could you modify some of your existing tier 2 interventions to strengthen and make sure that they do fit, and we've got data and they can operate within a tier 2 system of support. All right, thank you for watching this training, and that really kind of wraps up this continuum of tier 2 supports and tier 2 interventions. As you think about the basic vanilla check-in, check-out, to tweaks, to modified versions of check-in, check-out based on functional behavior, and now looking at what are some of the considerations and needs that we have when we start thinking about some of these other commonly used tier 2 interventions, which we probably got to manipulate and modify a little bit to really fit effectively within a tier 2 system of support, so we can really utilize data effectively to guide our decision making and ensure that we're implementing with a level of fidelity to get the effectiveness that we want. All right, so thank you, and best wishes in your tier 2 work.